the Strait of Hormuz has been closed for 95 days. By the time you finish watching this, it will be 96. 20% of the world's oil. 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 28 tankers anchored on either side, waiting for a green light that has not come. Brent crude settled this afternoon at $118 a barrel. The International Maritime Organization has documented 39 separate vessel strikes inside the strait since the closure began. 11 crew dead, 3 of them American. And in the last 72 hours, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, walked out of a building in Tehran, looked into a row of cameras, and told reporters there has been, and I'm quoting him directly, no significant progress in talks with the United States. The next afternoon, Donald Trump, sitting in the East Room of the White House for a press gaggle on infrastructure, said the talks were going very well. Both of those statements cannot be true. This is Professor Stephen, and if you want to understand how a war that the White House promised would be over in April is about to enter its second 100 days, subscribe right now, because the next chapter of this story is not being told on cable news. What's happening to the global oil market in the next 4 weeks cannot be undone by diplomacy. The damage is being baked into the system every hour the strait stays shut, and most viewers do not yet understand how irreversible that damage is. Let's start with the number that matters, because to understand why the ceasefire is already dead, you have to start with what's actually moving and what isn't. The maritime intelligence firm Kepler, whose satellite data tracks every commercial tanker on every ocean, published its latest Strait of Hormuz transit count this week. 41 vessels, 41 tankers across an entire week, in a choke point that in a normal month moves between 15 and 17 million barrels of oil per day. The Kleeper senior analyst Matt Smith told CNBC the operational reality bluntly. He said the route is, his words, functionally non-commercial, not closed by treaty, not closed by formal blockade, closed by the fact that no insurer at Lloyd's of London is willing to write hull coverage on a Suezmax tanker that has to thread a 21-mile waterway where the IRGC has already laid, by the Pentagon's own count, more than 20 sea mines and where 11 sailors have already died. That is the first thing to hold in your head. The strait is not closed because Iran has a navy that can hold it shut. The strait is closed because the insurance market has decided the risk is uninsurable, and a tanker without insurance is a tanker that no captain will sail. Iran does not need to win a naval battle. It only needs to make the underwriters at Lloyd's flinch, and the underwriters at Lloyd's flinched 95 days ago. Now, consider this. Maersk, the largest container shipping company on Earth, MSC, the second largest, and CMA CGM, the third, all three issued formal rerouting notices to their corporate clients between the 3rd and the 11th of April. Every Maersk vessel scheduled to call at Jebel Ali, Bandar Abbas, or any port inside the Persian Gulf is now being redirected. The new routing goes around the Cape of Good Hope. That adds approximately 14 days to a Singapore to Rotterdam voyage, and roughly $1 million in fuel cost per round trip. Maersk's own investor disclosure on April 22nd confirmed the company expects a $400 to $600 million earnings hit this quarter alone. Take a second on that sentence. 3 companies that control somewhere between 40 and 45% of global container shipping have collectively decided the Persian Gulf is no longer a commercial route. Not for the day, not for the week. They have rewritten their schedules through the end of 2026. That's not a ceasefire response. That's a planning horizon, and the planning horizon does not include the strait being open. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gave a closed-door briefing to the Senate Banking Committee on May 28th, the text of which was partially leaked to Bloomberg the following morning. Bessent's framing was striking. He told the committee that the Treasury Department is now working from what he called a fragile reservoir assumption. That phrase comes from petroleum engineering. When a producing well is shut in under emergency conditions, instead of through orderly procedure, the water table beneath the oil column begins to migrate. It's a process called water cooning, and it is permanent. When the well is eventually reopened, it does not produce just oil. It produces a mixture of oil and water in increasing proportions, and its productive capacity is permanently degraded. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies published a working paper on May 15th estimating that if Iran's emergency shut-in continues past day 100, the permanent production loss across the Iranian oil patch could reach between 300 and 500,000 barrels per day. Permanent, not until the war ends. Not until the deal is signed. Permanent. At an annualized average price of $80 per barrel, That's between $9 and $15 billion a year. Every year, subtracted from Iranian revenue, regardless of what Araghchi or Trump or anyone else writes on a piece of paper in Muscat or Doha or Geneva. And this is the part the headlines are missing entirely. The diplomatic conversation is being conducted as if a deal next week restores Iran's oil industry next month. It does not. The geology is decaying every day, the wells stay shut in the wrong way. The market is restructuring around the absence of Iranian crude every day the tankers don't move. Karen Young, the Columbia University Energy Policy Fellow, whose work on Gulf petrostate fiscal policy has been the most cited body of analysis on this question for the last decade, wrote in Foreign Policy on June 3rd that the ceasefire framework, even if signed, no longer addresses the underlying structural shift. Her phrase was that the war ended its negotiability around day 60. We're past day 95. Let me catch myself here because I don't want to oversell it. There are reasonable analysts who will tell you that water coning is recoverable on a longer time horizon, that Iranian petroleum engineers know how to manage shut-in damage, that the Foundation for Defense of Democracies has an institutional incentive to maximize the permanent damage estimate. All three of those things are partially true. The honest answer is that we will not know the full extent of reservoir degradation until the wells are reopened and we see what comes out of them. What we do know is that the assumption underlying every public statement Trump has made about this war, that a deal returns oil prices to where they were on February 27th, is an assumption no serious oil analyst is willing to sign their name to anymore. Now, look at the architecture Iran has actually put in place. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies tracker on what the Treasury Department calls Operation Economic Fury, the designations program targeting Iranian shadow banking infrastructure, has logged 73 new individual and corporate designations since the start of the war. 35 of those came in a single week in early May, when the Treasury Department named entities tied to IRGC oil sales facilitators in the UAE, Hong Kong, and Turkey. $300 million in cryptocurrency assets frozen. White House sources told CNBC that Iran is now losing approximately $500 million in oil revenue per day. $500 million. $15 billion a month. The IRGC's own annual budget, by the most credible open source estimates, is somewhere between $20 and $30 billion total. The blockade is, in real time, depriving the IRGC of an entire annual budget every 6 to 8 weeks. And then, Araghchi's no significant progress comment was not a freelance moment. It was authorized. The Iranian Supreme National Security Council convened an emergency session on May 31st. The summary of that meeting was leaked to Iran International on June 2nd. The council concluded, and these are not my words, this is the regime's own internal language, that talks with the United States have entered, quote, a phase of strategic stagnation. The council also concluded that the regime could withstand the current pressure for 6 to 8 additional weeks before structural political risk becomes unmanageable. That's not opposition rhetoric. That's the regime's own security apparatus writing down its survival timeline in cold bureaucratic prose. There is a phrase the council uses 3 separate times in the leaked summary that I want you to take seriously: asymmetric retaliatory architecture. That is the term of art the IRGC's Strategic Planning Bureau has been using since approximately 2014 to describe the network of escalation options Tehran has built specifically to survive a scenario in which conventional confrontation with the United States is no longer affordable. The phrase shows up in the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's translated archive of leaked Iranian planning documents. It shows up in the Hudson Institute's 2023 working paper by senior fellow Behnam Bentaleblu on Iranian deterrence posture. And it now shows up 3 times in 8 pages in the Council's own emergency session minutes from May 31st. The regime is, in its own internal language, telling itself that the conventional path is closed and the asymmetric path is open. That is the language a regime uses when it is about to do something the Western mainstream press is going to describe, after the fact, as unexpected. When Trump says talks are going very well, he is either reading from a brief that has not been updated since April, or he is performing for an audience that does not yet have access to the Iran international leak. The ceasefire framework signed in Muscat at the end of April was contingent on 3 things. First, a verification regime on Iranian enrichment through the IAEA. Second, a phased withdrawal of U.S. naval assets from the immediate vicinity of Larak Island and Hormuz Island. Third, a reciprocal cessation of strikes on energy infrastructure. None of those 3 conditions have been met. IAEA inspectors have not been granted access to Fordo since April 19th. The USS Spruance is still operating inside the Gulf of Oman, and the IRGC struck a tanker off Bandar Lanech on June 2nd. The ceasefire framework is text on a page. It is not a thing that exists in the physical world anymore. Let me bring this back to what it means for American markets and your financial reality right now. Brent at $118 a barrel is not a number that lives in an oil trader's terminal. That number prices into U.S. retail gasoline with a roughly 4 to 6 week lag. AAA's national average yesterday was $4.71 per gallon. On February 27th, the day before the war began, that number was $3.55. That's $1.16 per gallon. If you drive 12,000 miles a year in a car that gets 25 miles to the gallon, that is $557 out of your pocket in a single year just on fuel. And that's before you account for what $118 Brent does to airline fares, to diesel-dependent food distribution, to the heating oil that comes up the New York Harbor barges every fall. The Dallas Fed published a working paper on May 19th, estimating that the war has added approximately 1.4 percentage points to U.S. headline CPI. The Fed's Open Market Committee minutes from the May 28th meeting, released yesterday, used the phrase supply-driven inflation persistence 4 separate times. That language was not in the March minutes. That language is the Federal Reserve telling you, in the most polite way it knows how, that the path back to 2% inflation no longer assumes a near-term Hormuz reopening. Mortgage rates this morning were at 7.38%. The 30-year fixed has not been below 7% since this war began. Your 401k, if you have one, is sitting on an S&P that is down 4.2% year-to-date in the year when consensus expected double-digit gains. This war is sitting inside your grocery cart and inside your mortgage and inside your retirement statement, and the assumption that a Trump-Iraqi handshake next month makes any of that go away is an assumption that almost nobody who reads the actual transit data still believes. But here's the part the headlines are missing. The case for the ceasefire still mattering, and I do want to give it its strongest form, because I'd rather you walk away with the steelman than with a one-sided take, is that the storage math eventually forces a deal regardless of what's on paper. Kepler's Iranian onshore storage estimate has been running at 12 to 22 days of unused capacity since early May. Iran physically cannot keep pumping into a system with no outlet for much longer. The argument is that the regime's internal collapse timeline of 6 to 8 weeks and the storage exhaustion timeline of 3 to 4 weeks will converge sometime in late June or early July, and at that point Tehran signs something, not because Trump wins, but because the alternative is collapse. I genuinely like to believe it. The math is real. The storage is real. The Supreme National Security Council document is real. But here is what that argument does not address. A regime that is 6 weeks from internal collapse is not a regime that signs a clean ceasefire. A regime 6 weeks from collapse is a regime that makes one last asymmetric move. A closure of the Bab el-Mandeb through the Houthis, a strike on the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, a sabotage operation against a Saudi loading terminal at Ras Tanura. The structural physics of cornered regimes is that they don't quietly accept the terms. They escalate sideways to create a new bargaining surface, and nothing in the current U.S. posture is positioned to absorb that sideways escalation without an additional spike in Brent and an additional dollar at the pump. So when Erici says no significant progress and Trump says very well, what you're watching is not a misunderstanding between two diplomats. You're watching two different countries reading two different physical realities. The Iranian foreign minister is reading the SNSC document. The American president is reading a talking points memo. Both of them are telling the truth about what's in front of them. Neither of those documents describes the system that is actually unfolding in the water and in the wells and in the shipping insurance market and in the storage tanks at Karg Island. Let me bring it back to ground, to what you can actually watch for, because I'd rather give you instruments than predictions. Watch 3 things over the next 2 weeks. First, watch Kepler's weekly Iranian onshore storage utilization report. It comes out every Tuesday. The number to watch is the gap between current fill and total capacity. The day it crosses 95% is the day the wells start getting shut in at scale, and that's the day the permanent damage clock accelerates. We're not there yet. We're close. Second, watch the price differential between Brent and the UAE's Morban grade, which is the benchmark loaded out of Fujairah. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline bypasses Hormuz entirely. The day Morban starts trading at a premium to Brent, and it is not yet, but the spread has been compressing for 6 straight weeks, is the day the global market formally prices in the assumption that Hormuz is structurally compromised, not temporarily disrupted. That's a structural break, not a headline. Third, watch the IAEA Director General's public statements on Fordo access. Rafael Grossi has been measured in his language all year. The day Grossi uses the word suspended instead of delayed, the ceasefire framework collapses publicly. That sentence is the trigger. 3 instruments: storage utilization, MERB and spread, Grossi's vocabulary. Watch those 3 and you'll see the inflection point before any cable network does. So let me leave you with the question I cannot fully answer myself, and I'll hand it to you to sit with. If one country with no functional navy by Western standards, with an economy a fraction the size of California's, can sit on 20% of the world's oil supply for 100 days and force the largest economy on Earth to absorb $1.16 per gallon at the pump and 1.4 points of CPI and a 7.38% mortgage rate, then what exactly is the thing still keeping the old assumption alive that the United States, with 11 carriers, strike row? Hormuz is not a geographic accident. It is a strategic ceiling, and every American president from Carter forward built foreign policy on the assumption that the ceiling could be lifted by force when necessary. Day 10, the day that assumption stops being a theory and starts being a counterexample. This is Professor Steven. I'll see you in the next one.